Hello, and welcome to The Resource, the podcast propelling employer brands to recruit smarter and retain better. I'm your host, Priscilla Peters.
And I'm your other host, Scott Dismuke.
All right, so we are going to dive into our annual report. So, are you ready to get to it?
Yeah, let's hit it.
All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to review the high points of our annual report. So this is the 2023 annual report. So we released this together in tandem, Conversion Interactive Agency and People Data Analytics, or PDA. We release this together, much like we do this quarterly. We do a quarterly, what we call a quarterly data download. It's driver recruiting and retention data. And then what we do is we do a full annual report where we go through all the data from the previous year and really call out takeaways, trends, things that we're seeing, and just really some things that hopefully you guys can take back to your teams and say, okay, are we doing this? How are we doing this? How does this data impact us? And all of those things. So we're going to go through this today. I'm going to talk about the recruiting data points and the trends and the takeaways that we have from a recruiting perspective. And then Scott's going to focus on the retention. So I'm going to dive right into the very first thing, like literally, as I was going back through all of our data and all of our information from 2023, the number one thing that stood out to me was that technology in recruiting is what took center stage last year. And I will tell you, it's taken center stage this year, and it's probably going to take next year. Like, we don't really see an end to that. So what do I mean by that, right? Like, what are some specifics relating to that? So let me tell you some things that technology is doing to really help us recruit better, okay? And recruit smarter. So first of all, and there's been lots of talk about AI. I know at the Recruiting and Retention Conference, we talked about it a lot. And we'll get to that later. But here's the reality is that advanced AI automation is really making an impact on how we recruit. It's helping us improve time to hire. And what I mean by that is there's carriers who, when they're implementing technology like Lead Assist, for example, and I know we've talked about Lead Assist a lot in the data points through the various episodes that we have, but it's dramatically impacting the time from lead to actual hire status. So short form to hire status. We're getting more full applications faster because of the technology. So instead of humans having to nurture the lead from the short form to the full app, machines, bots, advanced AI automation is actually doing that. Here's some other things that are going on related to technology and recruiting. We have a new product that we just launched called Conversion Next. Inside of Conversion Next, we have AI behind the scenes that is helping us write job descriptions. So even if you do your own advertising and you don't have an ad agency, you could use a technology like Conversion Next, for example, that could actually help write your job descriptions with AI. No more coding is required for you to be able to create your XML feeds that go to all the job boards with your jobs. That's things that the technology is doing for us. I mean, the reality is that things like machine learning, predictive ad optimization, historical data. So we've been in business for 34 years, right? I would say the last decade and a half have been heavy digital media, social media that we've been implementing. So we have all that historical data. When you put that inside machines and inside technology, what it begins to happen is it says, hey, this ad that you're running in East Texas, it's going to be best if you run it here. And this is what the job description says. I mean, the reality is that computers and machines are learning things very, very fast at a much faster rate than humans are, right? And so what all of this does is it saves you time, it increases your efficiency, and it saves you money. At the end of the day, it helps with your budget. So if you're a recruiting leader today, what does that mean for you, right? Like you're like, oh, great, Priscilla, you're using all these buzzwords, predictive optimization and AI and all this stuff. But what does that really mean for me? And what I would challenge recruiting leaders today, coming out of 2023, we're in a month, almost 2 months in to 2024 at this point, what you need to do is prepare your department, your recruiting team, for the technology that is here today and that the technology that we know will be here tomorrow. In other words, think about, does my team need to be structured differently? As I hire new recruiters, what should they look like? What types of folks should I hire? Is the structure of my entire team going to look different? It probably is. And I know those are things that we sit around going, oh, what does that really mean? And some of that's a little bit scary, but the rapid pace that all of this is happening is going to significantly impact how we recruit. And so I would just say a big takeaway is be sure that you're implementing and using technology that helps you be more efficient, that helps you save on your budget, and at the end of the day, gives you a good ROI on all of the investments that you're making when it comes to recruiting. So that's really the first big takeaway that I had.
So, from a retention standpoint, I'm going to kind of talk from initially, this first thing is kind of our top level. So, if you've ever read any of our data downloads or looked at any of our reports, the way PDA handles our data is we start with core issues and then we try to break it down to a root cause. So, our partners can really truly understand what about some of these core issues or drivers specifically talking about when they're sharing their feedback. So let's kind of look at 2023 at the core issue level, and these are issues that we all hear about within trucking. And so the top issue for 2023 was equipment issues, followed by compensation issues, and then operations. And that's pretty typical with what we've seen historically as kind of the top three issues. And as we get a little further into this, we're going to break some of that down for you. But just kind of a couple highlights that I would really want to touch on for 2023, and we'll get into this. But really, it's all about predictable pay right now with drivers, and I think that is really something that is happening because of what the freight market was in 2023, what the freight market, frankly, is still right now at the beginning of 2024. Is anything that is affecting the driver's ability to really kind of make that predictable pay is really kind of the big hang up right now. And whether that's miles issues, whether that is an equipment issue, whether it's a communication issue, that's really what this is about. You're going to hear me say that a lot in the next few minutes when we're talking about some of these data points, because that's really what it boils down to. But just a couple of highlights here. So equipment issues were at 31.9% for 2023. In 2022, that was actually 32%. So we're just slightly less than in 2023. But compensation was 28.5% of our feedback in 2023. In 2022, it was 24.5%. So that's actually up 4% from where it was in 2022. Now, if you go back to 2022, we really started seeing the equipment or the compensation issues start to rise at about the end of Q3 of 2022, which is right in conjunction when we started to see the slowdown of freight. And then it really picked up in Q4, and then it just continued throughout the year. Now, we're starting to see a little bit of that tick down from a driver standpoint, from a compensation standpoint. But, and we'll talk about this in a second, drivers that are talking about compensation right now are not talking so much about pay rate. That is an issue, but they're really talking about miles. So of the drivers that are mentioning compensation right now, more than half of those are talking about miles or lack thereof. So we'll get into that a little bit more. Operational issues were at 18.6% in 2023. In 2022, they were at 19.3%. So we're a little lower on operation issues. Personal issues were the fourth issue that we hear about. Most of that, surrounds family issues or personal health issues. Home time issues were the fifth issue. They were 5.4% in 2023. In 2022, they were 6.9%. So home time issues actually went down a little bit in 23 as well. Drivers talking about issues with orientation and training were at 3.5%. That was actually down as well from 2022. It was at 4.3% in 2022. So we went down a little bit there. Um, Company related issues. So this is going to be kind of company policy type issues, company culture, where it's speaking more to the culture of the company. Those were at 2.5% in 2023. In 2022, they were at 1.9%. So we were up slightly on company issues. And then there's a couple of other issues that you can see in the report that are less than 2.5%. What we'll do here in a second is we're going to take these top three issues of equipment compensation and operations, break them down a little bit for you, and kind of give you some things to think about as you're into this year. As we still have some uncertainty as to what the economy is going to do. We think it's going to turn around. We don't know when it's going to turn around. But there's some things that we need to keep in mind. And a lot of that's going to come back to the predictability of the pay for the drivers. So we'll get into that here in a second.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And one of the things I would say to that is a lot of people say, okay, that's great. That's retention data. I need to focus on that. But you can focus on those things, all of those different buckets that you mentioned. If I'm a fleet and I know I excel in some of those areas, sell that on the recruiting side, right? So if I know my equipment is top notch and my equipment is where it's at, you got to tell that story. Like if you pay in such a way that does provide predictability for drivers, you got to tell that story. So that's good stuff. Always good to share that with your teams and so that people know like these are really, this is what's really important to drivers. So my second takeaway in the annual report just regarding recruiting is, and listen, I'm not sure that I've ever done an overall recruiting, like as we speak, different events and conferences and trade shows across the country. I'm not sure I've ever done a keynote or a workshop where I have not talked about the driver lead funnel. So y'all just roll your eyes all you want at the advertising marketing person because we're about to go full funnel. Okay. So here's the deal. The reigning leader in driver recruitment is still the comprehensive full funnel strategy. So when I say that, what I mean is if your recruiting strategy is I just want leads, just lead gen, that's great. I know why you want leads. I get that. But let me tell you, you're not going to get those leads unless you somehow start at the top of the funnel. You have to have some strategies in place in what we call the top of the funnel, the awareness phase. So if y'all been around very long, the three categories the driver lead funnel are awareness phase, consideration phase, and then conversion phase. So let me give you some data for each phase from 2023 that will kind of tell the story of why this is really so important. So when you think about the awareness phase, this is where drivers are really just building their brand preference for your company. And remember, Scott, we asked drivers on the last driver survey, hey, does it matter to you if you are familiar with the brand or not? I think it was like 57% said, yeah, I'd like to at least know a little. I mean, I'd like to at least be familiar with them. And so when it comes to the awareness phase, here's a stat that really jumped out at me. So vertical video on social media platforms. So listen, I love my reels, right? And so we're talking Facebook reels, we're talking Instagram reels, any kind of vertical video, even just video within the news feed. Lead volume on Facebook reels specifically grew by 84% from Q1 to Q2 in 2023. That's just one quarter, 84%. So that's how many more eyeballs from drivers are on your reels content. Again, just throwing that out there. Like that's a good strategy in the top of the funnel, the awareness phase. That's something that worked really well. So then let's go down. We're going down to the consideration phase. This is more where you're saying, hey, here's a job posting. Check this out. Would this be something you think you're a good fit for? When it comes to the consideration phase, what we call SEM interactive. So think of that as like tier 2 search engines, SEM meaning search engine marketing. So Indeed, ZipRecruiter, all of those folks. That type of strategy was the number one best performing source for cost per hire in 2023. Best performing, like when you say, where do I get best bang for my buck? Best bang for my buck. That almost went off the train, didn't it? And so whenever when you ask yourself that question, think about that middle of the funnel. You're beginning to serve up job postings. Tell them a little bit about what's going on. So that's a stat from the consideration phase. And then when it comes to the conversion phase, and this is where the magic happens, right? Like this is where you get the lead in whatever form it comes in: phone call, short form, full application. Maybe they start a chat on your landing page. Um, this is the phase where you begin to really work the lead, right? And so when you think about the conversion phase, here's an interesting stat. So in last year, every month on average, the technology that we had in this phase of the conversion phase was engaging with 100,000 drivers a month. That's unbelievable to me. And so just think about what, again, we're going back to technology. Like, what do you have in place there when it gets to the conversion phase? Like, how are you nurturing those leads, and what does that actually look like? So again, you look at the full funnel strategy, you think about all of these things, and you think, wow, am I really doing that? Like, I don't know. One of the things I would recommend to recruiting leaders is to really think about, kind of challenge you and your team, your marketing team, your advertising agency, whomever it is that you work with on your driver recruiting, your marketing and advertising for drivers. Ask yourself, do we have a diversified media mix in place? Are we actually feeding every phase of the driver funnel? Because what the data shows is that those who invest in the full funnel, not just conversion and consideration. A lot of people just hang out in consideration. They're like, I just want the actual lead. But those who invest all throughout, they are actually more successful long term, especially, than those who don't. And so just think about that. I'm gonna kind of take this a little bit step further here in a second, just on some more high level branding type stuff. So, but that is, the full funnel strategy is something. Gosh, I've been doing this 27 years, and obviously it's looked different over the years, but it's still super important. Like, you've got to diversify your media mix. You've got to have all types of strategy in the mix. So that's kind of my second real takeaway there.
So you've said too that, as we've seen in the first part of 2024, though, that competition for drivers is picking up,
Yes.
right? So I would think that the top of the funnel is extremely important, particularly right now. Maybe more so than it has been
Yes.
recently, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
So second data point for me is we're going to break down a couple of these issues that we talked about a second ago. So the first one I want to talk about is equipment. So the big takeaway I want you to have as it relates to equipment is that equipment matters when it comes to retention. And so what do I mean by that? And I really think it's important now while we are still kind of lingering in this freight recession. So if you break down the equipment issues that we saw in 2023, the top issue that we saw were tractor issues. And really what we're talking about here are just kind of your breakdown, your mechanical issues that drivers, experience, that we all experience from a tractor standpoint. That was at 44.9% of all equipment issues were tractor related. The second issue was equipment assignment, and that was at 22.4%. So what is equipment assignment? This is specifically relates to how drivers are talking about your equipment as they come out of orientation. So you've just invested a large amount of money to recruit a driver, to bring them in, to put them through orientation. You put them up in a hotel, you feed them, and then you give them the keys to their truck. And this is the first impression really that they're having of you as a carrier. And we've got survey data that backs that up, that this is really what a driver says. This is what the carrier thinks about me as a driver by what that equipment looks like and how it runs right after I get through with orientation. And it's pretty substantial that that's how drivers look at it. So keep that in mind. So equipment issues, extremely important. That really falls into one of two categories when we break it down to a root cause. Again, it's a mechanical issue. So driver comes out of orientation, they get in their truck, and maybe the check engine light is on, or maybe the battery is dead, it doesn't start. The other thing is the truck is dirty. That's frankly even worse than the truck being broke down. So if they get in the truck and it's filthy, or one that we do hear a lot is a driver gets in and the previous driver's belongings are still in the truck. That is like the worst thing that you can possibly do for a new driver that you've just brought into your company. So equipment issues were second. Trailer issues, drivers having issues with their trailers, was the third issue at 12.2%, and then general maintenance issues were 11%. So let's talk about this a little bit. So equipment issues have been the top issue that we've heard from drivers, frankly, for now I think it's 3 years in a row. But here's what I would tell you: during a freight recession, these equipment issues are compounded, given the role that the truck plays in the driver's ability to log miles. Therefore, it's going to affect their compensation. So we're going to go back again to the predictability of pay here. So, so what do we look at equipment wise? And some of you may have heard me say this before, but when I look at equipment, when I'm analyzing data from one of our partners, when I look at equipment, what do I look at? I look for controlling what you can control. The one thing you have to know is you can't keep a truck from breaking down. The carrier understands that, and the driver understands that. It's just that is going to happen. There's going to be a tire blow. Something's going to happen to that truck. So you cannot control that. But here's a couple things you can control. Going back to the equipment assignment, you can control if that truck is properly detailed and inspected before you assign it to a new driver. So that's one thing you can control. The other thing that you to some degree can control is the general maintenance side of things. And what do I mean by that? How long that driver is in the shop. So some fixes are going to take a little bit longer. But what you can do if they're available is get that driver in a loaner. Now, we all know loaners are loaners for a reason. They're not usually the best, but it's better than breakdown pay. I can tell you that for a fact, that if you can get a driver in a loaner where they're still logging some miles while that truck may be in the shop for 2 or 3 days, that is far better than the breakdown pay. So anything that's going to affect the driver's ability to log miles when it comes to equipment is you have to control what you can control. So it appears that this freight recession is at least going to continue at least through the first quarter, possibly even the second, from everything we hear. So here's what I would tell you: your maintenance departments are going to play a key role in retention this year, as we saw last year. Get them in a loaner. It's a better option than breakdown pay. Do your best to keep that driver rolling, because that keeps this week's equipment problem from becoming next week's compensation problem, which is what we saw a lot of in 2023. And then finally, make that good first impression on the drivers that you just hired, the drivers that you just invested a lot of money to bring into your carrier. Make sure you're making a good impression on those drivers by detailing and inspecting equipment before it's given to that newly hired driver. So, as I said earlier, the drivers have made it abundantly clear that the condition of their equipment at assignment is an indication about how you feel about them as a driver and as a person. This is their home. This is their office. They're going to be spending an enormous amount of time there. The least we can do is give them good equipment, inspected equipment, clean equipment when you get them in right out of orientation. So equipment matters on retention because it affects other things. That is the other thing that we've seen with equipment data that's different than any of the other data we've collected, is that equipment issues cascade into other problems for drivers. So the more you're in front of those equipment issues, the quicker you can get them in and out of the shop to keep them rolling, the better off that you're going to be. So don't ignore your equipment issues when it comes to driver retention.
Yes. No, I think that's great. And also, it really matters in recruiting too. One of the things I know we had a data set a few months ago that came out from our social media team, and they did what we call A/B testing on some ads where they just did ads with just a driver, and then they just did ads with just the equipment, and then they did ads with the driver and the equipment. And the ones with the drivers want to see equipment, basically, is what it showed. Now, they want to see a driver and equipment most of the time, like paired together, but equipment was overwhelmingly the preferred, because a lot of times people say, are you just going to put my truck in the ad? Like, why do I have to put my truck in the ad? listen, I mean, that may be their home or their home away from home for sure. So equipment is definitely super important. That's good stuff.
It's also a source of pride for those drivers when they're sitting in a travel center,
Yes.
right? It's not just their pay rate they talk about. They want a good looking truck.
Yeah.
So they don't you don't want your driver sitting in a travel center saying, "Man, I'm just broke down all the time."
Exactly.
So you're right. It's important from a recruiting standpoint too.
You know what I just realized, Scott? You say data and I say data. It's a little potato going on here, which that's fine. That's totally fine.
Well, maybe that's a first five that we start asking to see who's
Do
right.
you say data or data? I think I say data. Yeah, I do. You say data. But anyway, speaking of data, my kind of third takeaway for recruiting leaders is this. In 2023, data stories created improved ROI on driver recruitment. So what do I mean by that? That's kind of a lot of big mouthful there. So carriers and fleets who were able to really drill down and understand their data. So not just like high level, not just like what's my cost per hire and what's my best source for hires, but really be able to drill down. They're better able to manage their KPIs. And listen, here's the deal. C-suites love data. Like when we go in and we talk to a carrier, even if they're not a client or most of the time they are a client, and we talk to them and we say, listen, here's a strategy recommendation we have. And sometimes people are like, why would you recommend that? Let me show you. Here's one. And then you just show them the data. Because when you can drill down and you say, oh wow, like things like we notice that some ads aren't performing as well in this market. And it's like, why is that the case? Because in this market over here, it's performing much better. Well, when you drill down and you look at the data, not only the advertising and marketing data, but you go into like platforms like Fleet Intel and you look at the pay in those markets and you go, oh, your pay is not competitive. Like you're paying drivers less, So in this market, then your competitors, and here's the fleets that you're competing against. And I mean, so I'm just saying, all around, when you look at the decisions you're making, when there's data behind it, it's super impactful. So in the annual report, we included some questions every carrier should be asking related to their driver recruitment data. So I'm going to go through these. And remember, you can download this annual report from the resource.conversionia.com. We'll put the link in the show notes. But here's some questions every carrier should be asking related to your driver recruitment data. Number one, and some of these are like duh, Priscilla, but number one, what are my best performing sources in my highest driver need areas? So you listen, if you're recruiting, you know what those areas are. You get phone calls and emails and meetings about these all the time, right? Like you're weekly going, man, how do I find drivers in XYZ, right? So you got to be able to drill down into that. Number two, which sources are providing me the highest quality applications and the most hires? One of the things we're seeing the data show is that in many cases, even if the cost per lead is a little higher, but the quality of the application from that lead is also higher, you're saving from a cost per hire standpoint, even if you get less leads. So again, you need a way to drill down into that. For conversion clients, we have LeadLink 2.0. I know, carriers use different tools, and that's a great tool for us. And our clients really love it. But just think about, how am I drilling down into that data? Number three, am I regularly analyzing how my budget is performing, not only overall, but also in individual markets? So again, I'm just going back to specifically those markets that are tough for you to hire in. What does your budget look like there? You can't treat those high need markets that are tougher to hire in with the same budget that you do a market that's not as hard, right? So you've got to be able to drill down into that and see if you're, analyze those budget allocations there. Number four, what are the metrics for each stage of the driver lead funnel? Y'all knew I was going to bring that up again, right? What are the metrics for each stage of the driver lead funnel? And what adjustments should I make based on that data? So, in other words, is the strategy I have in place in the awareness phase, like, what is the data behind that? How many eyeballs from drivers are on that? How many comments and shares and clicks and all the things am I getting? Is it worth the budget that I'm putting into that strategy? Again, you've got to be able to track this stuff. And it really helps when it's all in one place and you can track it all from one place. And then what areas from my key performance indicators, my KPIs, what areas from my KPIs need attention? You should have a set of KPIs that you're following. And listen, like I said, C suites love this. So if you go into your C suite as a recruiting leader and honestly as a retention leader, and you say, hey, look, these are the KPIs that I'm following, and I'm going to make strategy adjustments and budget adjustments based on this, and this from a data standpoint. This is the story our data is telling us. And then you go in and you make data driven decisions, if you will, based on that. That's impressive, right? Like that's a way. It's hard for the C-suite to go, no, we're not doing that. When you say, here's the data behind it. And so I just think that was one of the things that we really saw come out of 2023. We did some upgrades on our data platform last year, and it really paid off. And I'm just seeing more and more how important those data stories are. So that's kind of my third one. I know that's your love language. Your data is your love language. So
Yeah, yeah. So data to me is the kid that was in Goonies. Data is what we're talking about. Goonies is great. Goonies is great. So now my next data point is kind of the elephant in the room. We're going to talk compensation and kind of what the data told us from a compensation standpoint. So the top issue or for compensation was, to nobody's surprise, it was miles. So 56.3% of drivers in 2023, when they were talking about frustration with compensation, they directly tied it to miles. Now, if you go back to 2022, 48.7% of drivers were talking about miles in 2022. So you have an increase of 8% from 2022 to 2023. If that doesn't show you or tell you the effect of the freight recession that it had on drivers and their ability to make money, this tells you the story right here. Now, if you look at pay rate was the second top issue at 22.3%. If you go back to 2022, it was 29.1%. So the drop that you saw from year over year from pay rate went straight to miles. Now, let's talk about a couple things. So that 8% of jump on miles. So if you look at it for 5 quarters in a row, more than half of the drivers complaining about compensation pointed to miles as the primary contributor to their pay issues. So we're going all the way back to 2022 to Q4 of 2022 is when this started, and we really started seeing the data. Every quarter since then, more than half of the drivers have complained about miles. Now, I've also had several carriers say, but hey, we raised pay. So why are drivers still talking about pay rate? We raised pay during COVID. Yes, you did. Absolutely. But here's what we saw during the COVID freight boom, as all the carriers were raising pay. You have to remember all the drivers were still driving a lot of miles, so it meant great paychecks. But in 2023, we had fewer loads and fewer miles that meant that the drivers' earnings were taking a hit. So the drivers are failing to reap the benefits of those higher pay rates as a result of fewer miles and more frequent layovers. Okay. So this is another thing to look at. And we've been talking with several carriers about this right now. Look at the layover detention pay and how you're paying that. Look at your breakdown pay. Is it competitive? Um, Literally just talked to a carrier last week who wanted to know if their breakdown pay was competitive. And so we worked with Conversion and their fleet intel. So a little plug there for fleet intel for Conversion. If you don't have that, get it. It's great. To look and see was their breakdown pay competitive, and it was not. So they were looking at their breakdown pay and saying, okay, there's a way we can help those drivers out, and it wasn't competitive by a long shot, by the way. So that's the other side of the compensation thing that I think you should be looking at right now is how competitive are you with those other forms of payment, the layover, the detention, the breakdown, all of that stuff. Pay attention to that because it matters. Here's the other thing I would tell you from a compensation standpoint. Proactive communication is going to matter here, particularly right now, and as we continue to make our way through the freight recession. So one of the things that I would be doing right now is having conversations with your drivers and resetting expectations. Not telling them we're cutting pay. If you want a turnover problem, mess with their pay. But what you have to do right now, and this is something else you're going to hear me talk about here in a second, is it's about transparency. Okay. The more transparent you are with drivers right now, the better off you're going to be. So reset mileage and pay expectations with drivers. The other thing I would do is make sure they understand the economy right now. All they're seeing is what's coming in on that pay stub. So make sure you talk to them about the economy, the trucking economy, and what is going on, and frankly, what you're doing about it. Let them know, hey, this is what we're working on. These are some of the things that we're doing. Because the more transparent you are with them, the more in the loop that they feel. And I can't tell you how important that is for somebody who spends most of their day completely isolated from everybody else. So they're in that truck, and really the only communication they're having for the most part is on a onboard communication device. So they're sitting there talking and having those electronic conversations. So that proactive communication that you're going to be having with drivers, resetting those expectations from a miles and pay standpoint, letting them know what the company is doing to make it through, to kind of make our way through this freight recession. It makes them feel as part of the team, and that they know and understand the plan. The other thing I would tell you right now is it's extremely important to know which drivers in your fleet are struggling with miles. And what I mean by that is everybody's struggling with miles, but I'm talking about from a consistency standpoint. So if you've got a driver that may be running consistently 1,900 miles a week right now, you need to know if that driver hits 1,200 miles or 1,100 miles, and you start seeing some of that inconsistency. If you have drivers that are struggling with miles, particularly from a consistency standpoint, they are a high risk driver for you. It's plain and simple. They are a high risk driver, but you have to have the ability to know who those drivers are, and you have to have the ability to proactively reach out to those drivers to help them, to assist them, so they know that you're there to help them. If you have drivers that are taking extended home time right now, I would also tell you that's probably a high risk situation as well, because there's probably issues where drivers and their spouses or their significant others are having those conversations about getting those monthly bills paid. Everybody's struggling with that right now. That is within the industry from a driver standpoint. So the big thing is about predictability. We've talked about that. It's about proactively communicating. It's about transparency, and it's about getting in front of those issues with drivers who are struggling with miles, because that's what we're going to have to do until we get to the other side of this freight recession right now.
Yes. And so my next kind of takeaway is also related to pay. And one of the things that we saw in the data, Scott, you mentioned Fleet Intel. Thanks for that. So we look at driver pay data a lot. We have this data community called Fleet Intel where we can look at all of that. And one of the things that we saw as a pretty big takeaway for 2023, specifically the end of the year, driver pay data showed that starting pay for drivers began to decline in 2023. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that all of you who raised your pay from 2020 to 2022 decided, oh, we're going to cut pay. We know that would dramatically impact turnover. That is not what happened. However, some fleets, and it's showing in the data from a trend perspective, decided, yep, I gave those raises, but guess what? We're going back. We're going to lower our starting pay. Yes, those other drivers are grandfathered in or whatever you want to call it. They're existing drivers. We're not going to cut their pay, but we're going to have to, because of the way the economy is and the climate is today in freight, we're going to have to lower our starting pay a bit. A lot of fleets decided we're not gonna. I mean, there's very few sign-on bonuses that are happening at the moment. Now, I will say that's starting to tick up again, just because competition for drivers is kind of starting again. But when you think about all of the accessorial pay, um, you know, that they've kind of taken some of that away as well. And so, and when you look at the annual report, you'll see we have a graph there. So you can just see how driver pay trended with different trailer types, specifically for company drivers. But the reality is that knowing and understanding these driver pay trends in the markets where you operate, where you hire, where you're trying to retain is super important. So, like to Scott's point about miles and predictable pay, listen, we know from the data, we've asked drivers, how many times are you recruited in any given week? And they're recruited pretty much every day from someone else besides you. And so when it comes to compensation, because we know it's such a big part of their satisfaction, the driver experience. It's a big part of retention and recruiting. And so you have to really understand what you're going up against in the markets where you serve. And it may be that it's something that's not super significant, but the way your competitors are spinning it, you're losing the recruiting game because of that. So I would just encourage you to really make sure that you're understanding driver pay in all the markets where you hire. And then specifically, we just wanted to know and call out that starting pay did decline, specifically in the last couple of quarters of last year. Now, we don't have the data yet for Q1, but if you have fleet intel, you could go look at it, kind of in real time, if you will. But we'll pull that at the end of Q1 and kind of see how that's still trending. But that just kind of piggybacks off of what you just talked about, Scott, from a compensation standpoint.
Yeah, and I would add to that, and certainly understand why carriers have changed their starting pay and not obviously overall driver pay. But here's what I would tell you from the retention side of that is as you bring those new drivers on, and if you have lowered your starting pay, be prepared to answer those questions because I will tell you the drivers do talk. I mean, you know that. So you're going to get questions about, well, why is that person at this and I came in at that? That's not fair. It's understandable why we had to do that, and I understand why carriers did that. But it is going to cause you need to be prepared to answer those questions from those new drivers coming in with that new lower starting pay rate. Okay, so my next data point here, we're going to talk about operations. So it was about 18.6% last year. So kind of the two big issues with operations really kind of float around communication and planners, but both of those issues actually dropped from 2022 to 23. So communication issues were 47.8% in 2022. They were actually at 54.9%. So communication issues were down from 2022. Planners issues, which what we normally see here is when drivers are not making the miles that they want to make or the pay that they want to make, a lot of times they're going to blame the planners or they're going to blame the fleet manager. So planner issues were at 24.5% in 2023. In 2022, there was actually 26.6. We actually went down a little bit with the planner side of things. But here's a couple things that I would tell you, a couple things that we've kind of even touched on. Again, on the communication side, transparency. Give the drivers the good, the bad, the ugly. It's sometimes unpleasant to give them bad news, but they will appreciate the honesty. The other thing I would tell you from a communication standpoint that we see pretty consistently when we break down the communication issue is drivers complaining about no response or a slow response from a driver manager. The worst thing you can do is just not respond to drivers' communication. That is the absolute worst thing you can do. If you want a turnover problem, don't communicate with your drivers. Don't let the fleet managers won't communicate with the drivers. If you want a turnover problem, that's the first step I would tell you to do. So what I would tell you from a communication standpoint is a couple things. Mirror the driver's communication. If the driver is calling, call them back. If they're sending the message over the Qualcomm or your onboard communication device, they're going to communicate with you in the way in which they prefer to be communicated with. So I would say more of your old school drivers are going to want the phone. More of your younger Gen X type drivers, they're going to want probably to communicate electronically with you, but mirror that driver's communication habits. But definitely don't let it go unanswered. If one of the things that we're telling drivers all the time, if they call in and somebody hasn't responded, we're going to encourage them to use multiple forms of communication. But what I would tell you is we know driver managers are working with multiple drivers every single day. So they can't physically answer every single phone call. They may be on the phone with another driver when that driver calls in. While they're doing that, let's multitask a little bit. Let's send that driver that just called that you didn't answer, send them a message on the onboard communication device saying, hey, it was on the phone. I'll call you right back. That goes so far with the driver when they get that little bit of communication, knowing why the phone wasn't answered. Proactive communication, keeping drivers in the planning loop, letting them know the what behind the why. Why are you planning them the way that you are? Or again, going back to what we talked about at compensation, resetting that expectation so they understand the plan, they understand the miles and how that's going to play out. The other big thing to remember here, particularly from a communication standpoint, is, and we've said this before on other podcasts, but I think it's an important point, so I'm going to repeat it, is remember those drivers that came in during the COVID boom, those drivers that were new to the industry then, because there was a lot of them, because drivers were seen as the heroes, as they should be. But they are now experiencing their first freight slowdown. And so if we see that those drivers are struggling, which they are, those are the ones that are causing a lot of the turnover right now, or they're the ones that are looking to leave the industry altogether, it's because this is new to them. They don't understand that the freight recession and how the trucking economy is cyclical and things like this happen all the time. They just expected that COVID freight was typical freight, which we clearly know is not the case. So that transparency, that openness, that open line of communication, the proactive communication that you can have with drivers to get in front of issues is so unbelievably important. And I would tell you that is one major thing that you should focus on in 2024 is how you're communicating.
Yes. Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. So the last kind of takeaway that I have is going back to the top of the lead funnel that we've talked about. So one of the things that we recognized in 2023 was that carriers that saw the value of their employer brand and their online reputation, meaning like how drivers are reviewing them online, because lots of drivers like to give lots of reviews. Those folks who are investing in those employer brand, online reputation types of strategies, they are outperforming the competition. So let me give you some data related to that. And what ends up happening, Scott, is like when it's a down economy and you got to look at like, what do I cut? What am I going to cut here? A lot of people say, we don't need to do this branding and online reputation stuff. Like we don't have the budget for that. And in reality, it's a tiny little part of the budget. It's not super expensive. But when you do invest in it, it does pay off, particularly long term. So let me give you some quick data points here. 74% of drivers, remember we asked this on one of our driver surveys, 74% of drivers said that they go to online driver reviews first when looking for a job. First. So they might see your job description or they might see something about your carrier. They're going to be like, what do drivers think about that? They're going to go to Indeed, Facebook, Google, Glassdoor, all those places to look at the reviews and see what drivers say. If you're not responding to those reviews, monitoring those reviews, that's a problem. So make sure that you're looking at that. The second thing is we pulled the data, we drilled down, and we found that carriers that have a 3+ review, so it's like a 5-star, typically 5-star rating on all of these sites. Carriers that have a 3 or better rating, they save 48% on cost per hire compared to those that are 3 or under 3. Okay. That's a lot. That's almost half, right? So think about that. Sorry. I said that wrong. 48% on a cost per application, 14% on cost per hire. So I was wrong on the first one. So you're saving on the cost per application, the cost per full app, if you will, it's almost half the cost if you have a 3 or plus better rating, and you're saving 14% on cost per hire. Y'all, that's significant. So really think about how you're managing your online reputation. And then I mentioned this earlier, I forgot this was included here, but 57.3% of drivers did say they prefer to have some familiarity with the company, with their employer brand before they apply for a job with you. So at the end of the day, long term, and frankly short term, really, I mean, if you think about it, employer branding, when you prioritize that, when you prioritize your online reputation, it becomes evident in the data, in your KPIs, and all the things that you're following from a recruiting perspective. So make sure that you're emphasizing that top of funnel type stuff and your employer brand and your online reputation in 2024. It really, really will pay off.
Yep. So here's my last data point, and then we'll kind of sew this thing up because I know we've gone a little bit longer today, but there's a lot of great data here. So I'm going to kind of really briefly talk you through what were the top 10 issues, kind of root cause issues for drivers who voluntarily left their jobs in 2023. And there's a couple things I'll point out. Some of it's going to be a little bit repeated, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. So the number one issue were tractor mechanical breakdown issues. We talked about that earlier. Number two was pay rate, not competitive or better offer. Number three were miles, loads not available. Number four were personal family issues. Number five was equipment assignment, mechanical breakdown issues at assignment. So again, going back to what I said about equipment assignment, that lets you know how important it is because it was the fifth top issue for drivers who voluntarily left their job in 2023. The number six issue was inconsistent miles. Number seven was no response from a driver manager on a communication side of things. Number eight were personal health issues. Number nine were miles, poor scheduling and planning. That's going to go back to kind of the layover discussion and having to wait between loads a little bit longer than the driver would like. And then number 10, was a slow response from a driver manager. So we've kind of touched all the bases on those, on some of those. Again, it shows you the importance of communication. It shows you the importance of equipment and why equipment matters. But if you think about it, 4 of the top 10 issues were centered around miles and compensation. It clearly shows that the economy and the freight recession is affecting the driver's ability to make the kind of money that they're expecting to make. So again, predictability of pay. I know I've talked about it a lot, but it is the most important issue right now. And the great thing is that some of these other issues that all feed into kind of that predictability, you have control over. Equipment, aside from the just typical breakdowns, you can make sure that those trucks are properly inspected and detailed before you assign them. The proactive communication, the transparency, the responding to drivers, all of those things can lessen the blow of that lower paycheck right now as a result of the freight recession. So communicate. Equipment matters. Obviously, the predictability of the driver pay matters. It's showing up in the data. It's showing up in here for drivers who voluntarily left their job in 2023. And it would not surprise me as we look at Q1 data when it comes out at the end of March, we're going to see some of these same issues because the economy hasn't turned enough for some of these issues to really change. So pay attention to those things going into 2024. Here's what I would tell you. I know we went a little long here. I'm going to kind of plug the place where you can download all this information. It's the resource.conversionia.com. You can also get there through both of our individual websites at pdateam.com and Conversion's website, which I believe is conversionia.com. You can get there through all of these. You're going to see some of the 2024 forecasting that we do, which obviously I'm just going to spoil this. It has a lot to do with the economy still until that turns around. So I'm going to leave with kind of this one point, Priscilla, and I'll let you kind of talk about, plugging R&R for next year. Here's what I would tell you. While we've had the economic challenges and that has prompted many folks, including us, to tighten our belts, right? Here's what I would tell you. Neglecting investments in both recruiting and retention can be a costly mistake. So in the long run, the benefits of recruiting and retaining experienced drivers far, far outweigh the short-term savings associated with cost cutting right now. So I know it's an easy place to cut. I know a lot of people are doing it, but if you've listened to our previous podcast with Tom Albrecht, you should. He talks about preparing to thrive. Preparing to thrive is recruiting and retaining those experienced drivers and not turning off that spigot. If you do that, you're going to be behind the game when this thing flips, and we know it's going to. So that's kind of my little parting shot. Priscilla, I'll
Yeah.
let you give yours.
Yeah, no, I echo all of that. I would just say, as you're going through Q1 in 2024, my big question is, are you ready? Like, are you ready for when capacity tightens, when you need more drivers? Are you ready? And so, if you have the technology, the strategy, the data, the expertise behind you, then you will be. So, I would just kind of call out that challenge as we're wrapping up here today. Yes, you mentioned R&R. So we just finished R&R 2024. It was amazing. So if you want to register for R&R 2025, you can do that, but not until October 1st. We always open registration on October 1st, but if you want to pencil in the dates for 2025, it's going to be February 19th through the 21st, always in Nashville. And that will be in 2025. We're going to be at the Grand Hyatt in Nashville for 2025 downtown. So this was great. Lots of amazing information. We'll put all of the links to where you can get the annual report and the resource for all of our other resources in the show notes. So thanks for listening today. If you got some great information, some data, some trends you could take back to your team, give us a high five by leaving us a rating or a review on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to follow us or subscribe there as well, so you never miss an episode.
And if you've got any feedback or anything you want to share, or maybe a topic you'd like for us to hit on, you can hit us up on social media or via email, and we'll be back next month. And next month's going to be a recap of R&R. We've got several people that we've interviewed at R&R, and so you don't want to miss that. And we will also be able to give you some more data and to help you in your recruiting and retention game. So we look forward to seeing you next month. Take care.